silk is supposed to be called as the queen of fibers because it has that rarity in its smoothness, gloss and the brighter colors it gives. It is a royal fiber right from the beginning, and there is a small legend that goes along with this. They say that the queen of Yellow Emperor was the first person to identify silk. It so happened, it seems, that when she was sitting under a tree to have a cup of tea, and there was a cocoon that fell into her cup of tea, and when she was trying to remove this particular cocoon from it, and she saw that it was continuously coming as a particular strand, a white glossy strand, and this made her realize that it is a fiber that can be extracted from this, and that is how the story of silk has started. And to say that this particular secret was maintained by the Chinese for a very long time, and it was also mandatory for the Chinese that only the royal families can use silk and not the common man. And slowly, after keeping that for a secret for nearly 3000 years, it was stolen out from China when some people have travelled towards the other countries, where they have kept these particular worms and the seeds not seen for the people, and that is how it was stolen out, and only then we can see that this particular fiber was started being done by the other parts of the world. So, when we see this in China in the 14th century, this was a very good and a big industry in them, in this particular country, and it was a fiber because of this soft touch and light in weight, and because of this, these properties make this particular fabric or the fiber very important for this particular fiber, and that is one of the reason why maybe the industry of silk has started. So, when we take about how which countries are producing this silk, we see that China is the first country to produce the silk, and followed China, our India is the second country which is producing silk in a larger quantity. And there is some specialization towards India, where India can produce all 4 varieties of silks, whereas China does not produce all the 4 varieties of silks. And we are also producing and exporting to countries like USA and the European Union. Now, when we take the silk production, it starts with the rearing of the silkworms, and this we call it as the sericulture. Here the moths that have emerged from a cocoon are first allowed to mate, and these female moths are again allowed to lay the eggs, and around 300 to 400 eggs are laid at a time. And these eggs are kept in the granaries, and as and when required, these can be utilized for the production process, and it takes around 30 days for the egg to hatch into a small larva. And when it is first hatched, the size of this larva would be a pinhead. You can say that it is a very tiny minute one, and this would undergo a lot many changes, and it would reach an adult stage of around 7 to 10 centimeters. So, for this, for growing, silkworms require mulberry leaves, and they are fed on mulberry, and in fact, the cultivated variety of this silk is also called as mulberry silk. In the beginning, when the larvae are very tiny, leaves of this mulberry are cut into small pieces or shredded into small pieces and fed 5 times a day, because they are voracious eaters, and within a span of 45 days they would grow from the pinhead to a large size of 10 centimeters length. So, after feeding and during the process, they also undergo the molting process. So, in the molting process, they shed their skin 4 times, and then they grow into an adult. So, at the time when they reach a maturity stage, when they are 7 to 10 centimeters long, then they cease to eat, that is, they stop eating, and then the head of the worm is lifted up, and it gives a very rare movement to the head, which indicates that it is ready to spin the fiber. So, under this condition, some support is given to the worm, and they are placed in different bamboo containers, wherein they spin, the head movement is in such a way that it is in the form of letter 8. So, it moves its head in the letter 8 and thereby it starts spinning. And there are two salivary glands that are present underneath the worm. They are called as fibrins. These two strands of fibrins along with a gummy substance called the sericin together will be spun at a time, and it encloses itself within 3 to 4 days by enclosing with the spinning of this particular fiber. So, this sericin, which is a gummy substance, and the fibroin, which is a protein which is in the liquid form, will be extruded through the spinneret of this worm, and this upon the atmospheric conditions it solidifies and forms into a hard yarn. Now, this particular thing after 4 to 5 days of spinning, then when it is completed, it takes another maybe 10 days to change this larva into a chrysalis in the same cocoon. At this stage, generally it is not allowed to live longer, because once the moth is allowed to emerge out of the cocoons, then the fiber cannot be taken in a very continuous strand. So, for this there are certain cocoons which they select and then they allow for the further breeding, and the other cocoons are done a process called as stifling. So, in the stifling process, these chrysalis which is present within the cocoon is exposed to either sun or heat or the fumigation, where it kills the larvae within the cocoon itself. So, under these conditions it can be sent to another factories where silk reeling takes place, called the filature operation. If the chrysalis is allowed to remain in the cocoon itself and it is not stifled, then after 10 to 15 days you can see the moth emerges by dissolving a part of the cocoon with a chemical that it has developed by itself, and through it makes a hole in the cocoon and it comes out of the cocoon. So, in such cases these cocoons we cannot get a continuous fiber from these cocoons. So, they undergo a process like a spun silk, that is the short fibers, where the short fibers are again spun on the cotton system to make a spun silk. So, after this you can see the worm that goes again will undergo the breeding process once again, starts its life cycle once again. Now, the ones which have been stifled will be taken to a filature operation or the factories where reeling takes place. When we see the complete sericulture, we see that there are 4 stages where the egg is laid, where there is a pupa, then you see the chrysalis and then the moth emerging after that. And when we take the weight of the worm, from the larvae to the final stage where it reaches the maturity, it grows in weight around 10,000 times. So, to grow to that level it requires a lot of feeding only on the mulberry leaves. Once the cocoons are given into the filature operation, the first thing the people do there is sorting out the cocoons, because there are different colors we see from the white to yellowish or the greyish colors. They have to be first sorted out depending upon the source and type of food we get these particular colors. So, they remove these yarns from the cocoons in a process called as the reeling, and the first time they do it in hot water, as I told you, is the process called as a cooking process. So, they take water about 95 to 97 degrees centigrade and then boil it for 10 to 15 minutes, and then when they stir it, you can see it loosens out and the fiber is taken in the form of a thread. And when we at this stage we can see that it is called as a raw silk, because when we see it contains a lot of sericin, around 20% of sericin is present in that, and about 80% of protein is present in particular thing. In this boiling of process, we see that only 1% of sericin is removed and the other part is left remained in the fiber. This is because without the sericin content, it is not possible to further process the particular yarn. In fact, it forms as a protective layer to the fiber, which helps out in the further processing. And when we see in when I told you that when it is extruding the fiber, it is the 2 strands that is extruded, but these 2 strands are very thin and they cannot be reeled into yarn, and so for that process generally 3 to 10 cocoons are reeled together. So, this is called a process of where twisting is given, and this is called a silk thrawing. So, this word, the Anglo-Saxon word from thrawn, it means that it is the twist. So, yarn that is a resultant of this is called a thrawn yarn. Now, sometimes to get more effects, this particular thrawn yarn can be combined with an other twisting yarn, and then you can create lot many types of things. Now, when we see this raw silk, the length of the thread ranges from 300 to 600 meters, and we require about 55,000 cocoons to make weight of 1 kg silk. So, 50 to 100 grams of these skeins, we call them, is made into a bundle called a book, which weighs around 5 to 10 pounds. These are the general weights that are followed in the silk industry. Size of the fiber is also considered, where we call the size in terms of denier, which represent that it is the weight of the fiber in grams per 9,000 yards. So, the lesser the denier, the finer is supposed to be the silk. And here when it goes for the spinning process, we can see that there are different amounts of fibers that are combined together. It can be 3, it can be 6, it can be more than that, depending upon the end use of the fabric. So, when only more than 3 or 4 are used, we get a lightweight fabric, and more number of filaments are twisted together, we get a heavy fabric. The next process is degumming. In the earlier boiling off process, only 1% of sericin is removed. Now, in this process, we try to remove the 20% of sericin that is present in it. The degumming process is a specialized process meant only for the silk fiber, and it is to remove the sericin. Degumming is generally done sometimes for the yarn when it has to be finished with the dyes, and generally if it is to be woven into a fabric, degumming process is generally not done. Only after the fabric is made, degumming process is to be done. Exact process and the content of it, and what is to be done in the degumming process, everything will be already I think it must have been studied under the chemical processing or the chemical finishes that are given to the fibers. So, as it is, the silk that comes out of this process is called the boiled off silk. Now, what happens when 20% of sericin is removed from the fabric or from the yarn? The weight of the fabric or the yarn is reduced, and silk is always rated for its weight. So, when you go to the shop, you see that 80 gram silk, 60 gram silk, and so forth, they say that is based on the weight, the price would be depending. So, for that sake, what is to be done in now here is, in the industry, to regain the weight that is lost in the other process, they do a process called weighting, which is done with stannous chloride and other salts. There is a regulation for weighting of a silk, because the more the weighting is given, the more it is harmful for the strength of the fiber. For colored silks, it should be only 10%, whereas for the black it can be 15%, and this is also one of the reason why we see that in usage the black silk fabrics generally are more damaged on usage than the colored silks fabrics. So, this is generally followed in the industry. You can also identify a weighted silk as well as a normal silk by a small test at home, where if you take a weighted silk and burn the fabric and a normal silk, you can see the weighted silk fabric structure would never be disturbed. The structure would remain same, but it gets burned. That is one of the things that can be an identification mark for this. Now, as I told you earlier, India is one of the country where we can produce 4 different varieties of silks. The silks that are taken, or the worms that are reared on mulberry, are supposed to be called as mulberry silk, and we call it as cultivated silk. The other types of silks are supposed to be called as the wild silk, and this is also nowadays called as vanya silk, because from the forest this silk is obtained. The silkworms that are producing this wild silk are Tasar, eri, and the Muga. When we take the eri silk, it is also called as endi and erendi. The worm is the Philosomia ricini, and this generally feeds on the castor leaves. The worm itself makes a cocoon that is an open ended, and so it cannot be reeled out into a single filament, and it has to be spun yarn later on. The second variety is the Tasar silk, produced by the silkworms called Antheria mylitta. and this mainly feeds on the oak leaves, arjun leaves and the asan leaves. Then we have the another variety called the Muga silk, where it is the pride of India because it has a shimmering gold color. Muga silkworm called the Antheria assamensis, which feeds on Solu and the Som. So, this is supposed to be the very expensive silk and rare of its quality, and this silk is never dyed generally because it has natural golden color. Now, coming to the other types of silk, we also call it as waste silk or silk noil. When the spun silk is being done, the short fibers that come out is generally called as a silk noil or the waste silk. And then we have another variety called as a dopion silk. This also has to be spun yarn only. This is because instead of one worm making one cocoon, two worms come together and then they spin only one cocoon, each one of them giving out their own extrusion. So, in this case what happens is the silk cannot be reeled out as a single strand, and thereby it also has to be spun as a spun yarn. And in fact, the yarn is also very irregular, and so continuous filament cannot be done. There is another term called as raw silk. If it has not undergone any degumming process, we call it as raw silk. And the other variety is the spun silk or the staple silk. That is when the cocoons are pierced or from the wild silk generally is taken or spun on the process of cotton spinning, and so it is called as a spun silk. And we have one more variety called the khadi silk nowadays. The silk that is hand spun and hand woven is supposed to be called as a khadi silk, and we can see a lot of irregularities that we see in the weaving as well as some thin and thick places that are seen in the yarn as well. There is another term called as ahimsa silk. This is because there are people who has a huge cry about the stifling process that is being done to the cocoons, where the cocoons the chrysalis is killed inside the cocoon itself, and so now the process is ahimsa silk, where that means these cocoons are not stifled and the moth is allowed to emerge, and we are getting only the spun silk out of that. So, animal lovers who go for the ahimsa silk. Coming to the physical properties, we can see that there are different colors. When we take the cultivated silk, white to cream color wild silk, which is in brown color, strength of this fiber, this is one of the strongest natural fiber that is available with a tenacity of 2.4 to 5.1 grams per denier. So, the degree of orientation, hydrogen bonding, all these will add up to this particular strength of the fiber, and the strength of a staple fiber would depend upon the length of the staple that is used in the manufacturing. And when we take the structure of this particular filament or the fiber under the microscope, we can see that they are fine filament, they look like glass rods under the microscope, and the length of each fiber that we can take out of a cocoon would range around from 1000 to 1300 yards also, and generally 300 yards are supposed to be an average, and the width of the silk yarn is supposed to be 9 to 11 microns. The cultivated silk is smooth, cylindrical, uniform. When we take the cross section, we can see the two fibrins along with the sericin around them in a triangular shape, and the angles are slightly rounded off, that is the corners are rounded off. And whereas the wild silk, you can see it is a ribbon shape with longitudinal markings and very flattened. In terms of luster, the degummed silk is high but not as bright as a manufactured fiber. Because of the triangular shape, it has to be very shiny in fact, but because of the rounded shape of the triangle, you can see there is a lot of changes in the light reflection. And compared to wool, this is not a very elastic fiber, it can be stretched only from 1/7 to 1/5 of this original length before breaking, and gradually it would come back to its original size once it is stretched. So, the elongation at break also is almost half that of the wool. Coming to the abrasion resistance or resistance to rubbing, you can see that it has a very moderate resistance, but the smooth surface and the wedge shape will also help in resisting the particular abrasion. So, coming to the resiliency of this particular fiber, you have a resiliency that is of moderate level and it retains the shape, it resists wrinkling, and fabrics made of pure silk or spun silk also will have resiliency, but compared to the filament yarn, the spun silk fabrics will have a low resiliency. And silk has a pliability and suppleness and elasticity, resilience, all this will give an excellent drapability to the fiber or the fabric. So, the density of this fiber is 1.64, and that is one of the reason why a lightweight material can be made from this particular fiber without sacrificing the strength of the fiber. This is also an absorbent fiber, and this is one of the reason why you can see dark colors with the dyes that is possible on this. It takes around 11% of its weight of moisture, and about it, I mean, of course, though it take 11%, it also sometimes varies from 10 to 30% also. And this moisture absorption capacity is the one which is very easy for the dyer as well as the printer. And coming to the dimensional stability, it does not generally shrink much, but some crepe fabrics may shrink in laundering, but they can be restored after steaming this particular one. And coming to the thermal properties, thermal conductivity is low for this fiber like that of wool, and so this also is used for both the warmer climate as well as the cooler climate as well. Sometimes even the type of blending it undergoes also can be considered in choosing a fabric for a particular season. And when we try to give a burning test, we see that it smolders like that of a wool fiber, and then it burns very slowly in flame, and once you remove it from the flame, it puts off, and it also gives a brittle crushable bead after the burning process, and it is also self extinguishing, and it also gives a smell similar to that of wool, like a burning hair smell. In fact, all these protein fibers have a characteristic smell of burning hair smell. Now, when we take the sensitivity towards heat, it will begin to decompose at 330 degrees Fahrenheit, and so it has to be ironed when damp with a very warm iron, because white silk, when it is ironed at a temperature of 231 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes, it begins to turn yellow. In fact, like other fabrics, you cannot sprinkle water and then do the ironing process, because it leaves water spot marks on the fabric. So, in the damp condition only it has to be ironed. Coming to the chemical properties like that of wool, this is also sensitive to alkalis, and high concentrated acids generally like soda, caustic potash will generally try to deteriorate this fiber, and sometimes the heated solution of these alkalis will dissolve it. And concentrated mineral acids like that of wool will also dissolve this, but whereas organic acids do not harm them. This will get dissolved in HCl and of moderate concentration, and sometimes when we take the other mineral acids, they cause the fiber disintegration and sometimes the shrinkage. Similar to wool, you can see the characteristic of bleaching also, where we can see that hydrogen peroxide is the only safest bleach for this, other than the sodium hypochlorite and or the other chlorine bleaches. So, care should be exercised in this particular thing. Compared to wool, here we can say that this is a hygienic fiber because of its smooth surface, it does not take up any dust, and it is also very easy to clean with a mild soap, and sometimes you can go in for the dry cleaning as well. So, the shrinkage in this is not very high, and it is a normal shrinkage which can be restored by the ironing process when you iron it in the damp condition. So, coming to the effect of light, we can see the light weakens the silk fiber, and drying in shade is always recommended, and we see that raw silk is more resistant to sunlight than even the degummed silk. So, that of wool is not affected by the mildews unless it is left in a damp state and for a longer time. And the blend of wool and silk, the beetles of larvae and moth may affect, which will affect the wool, but not the silk directly. So, in case it is a 100% silk fabric, it is not that the moths would definitely attack it. Coming to the perspiration effect, we see that the fabrics are damaged by the perspiration if it is left inside, and so it is best is after every use you have to rinse them and then store it away. There is a reduction in the color strength and the color staining are the two major things that you observe for the perspiration. And silk also can be blended with other fibers like polyester, linen, wool and other things. And coming to the types of finishes, it can be given, it can be, we have seen about the degumming, the weighting, where calendering is also given for the smoothness, curing for improving the body or the luster, and embossing finish is given to create a textural effect on the surface, and water repellency is also given, and stiffening is also given. Generally here stiffening is the general starch powder cannot be given for the stiffening of silks. The gum arabica can be the one that can be given for the stiffening of silks, because it gives that characteristic scroop sound for the silk fabrics, whereas the starch content in the natural starch would generally harm the fabric, and in fact it would create some marks on the surface. And like wool, there is also a silk mark which has come up. This silk mark is promoted by the Silk Mark Organization of India, and this is under the Ministry of Textiles under the Central Silk Board. So, this provides a quality assurance label to the consumer, saying that if a silk mark is given, it means that this is completely mulberry silk, 100% mulberry silk, and also the consumer interest is protected in such a way that each silk mark has a hologram and it has a particular number, and so it cannot be duplicated. The manufacturers or the retailers have to apply for the silk mark, and each one has a unique number in it in fact. Now, the recent one is we have this as a sewn-in labels or in the form of a tags, but now we have the other one called as a fusion label. So, fusion label is a label that is fused along with the fabric, and in such a way that there is no tampering that could happen, and so it can be easily identified. And this is an initiative that is taken up by the silk mark, and so that it cannot be duplicated, because silk marks also have been duplicated to some extent. Now, coming to the uses of silk, you can see that it is, as it is a luxurious fiber, it is being used in apparels, and it is not new, because silk has been used since ages for, or it is a synonym with a garment used for festivals and other traditional occasions. And it is now also finding its way into the home furnishing area because of its lustrousness and the sheen that is present in it. And in terms of brocades, silk is the only one which is used mostly in the brocades, and this absorbency is something very, very appreciated, where it can be used even in the warm climate, even in the cold climate. And when we see that it is a combination with the other blends, we can see that it is one of the fiber with the blends more appreciated by the foreign countries, and demand is also there for the silk blends. It is not the silk alone, but the silk blends. It is not only abroad, but even in our own country, where they have started developing the brands like terry silk, cot silk, etc., where the polyester and silk is mixed and the cotton and silk is been blended together. So, now we can see that in home furnishings and also medical textile. So, that is wherever they use a certain suture material and all that, silk is supposed to be the one with, because it is the strongest one and the natural material. So, it is being used in the area of technical textiles as well. And mostly the eri silk or the spun silk, all the blends and all these we find in the upholstery and other materials, and garments like vest, gloves, stockings, all these are generally done in silk. And nowadays we can see that even in the industries and the military purposes, it is being used in parachutes, insulation coils, telephone wires, tires of racing cars, filter cloths. So, this is one of the most luxurious material that one can afford to, which has a versatility of properties in it, which can be used for various end uses by blending them or as such. And you can also make fabrics from a very light weight to a very heavy weight fabrics for its particular end uses.